Luke Perry, Utica College professor of government. His blog is Utica College Center of Public Affairs and Election Research, and he does an NY22 Minute. Luke Perry, good morning.
Good morning.
So Marques just said he doesn't know that a Democrat can win in a not-so-moderate NY22. What do you think?
Well, I think over time the districts has gotten less Republican. If you look at registered voters over the last 10, 15 years now, there's different ideological shifts. But right now I think the Republican Party is divided between the Tea Party that kind of morphed into the Trump supporters and more moderate Republicans a la Richard Hanna. So how all that sorts out, it's going to be really interesting.
Okay, so I want to, right off the bat, when we announced that you're coming on, I immediately heard from a Claudia Tenney supporter in Jim Zecca who said, well, you're tied to Anthony Brindisi. How can you be independent? Which brings us back to a fake blogger that was doing some trolling, a whole story that we covered back last year, right?
Yeah, I don't understand how people think I'm tied to Anthony Brindisi. I've actually talked to Claudia Tenney more than I've talked to him. So I don't know what the basis of that assertion is. That'd be a good question for your listener.
And the story that I'm referencing was actually a staffer, right, that was blogging as someone who was independent.
Yeah, it goes back to a story I wrote about someone who worked for Claudia Tenney who had a false persona on social media and communicated with me quite a bit through that, and then I came to learn that he was actually a staffer, and it was a very unusual experience, which I wrote about because, you know, misuse of public funds is sort of just basic journalism, and so it was in the public interest to write about it, and that was my motivation.
So what is your take? Is we are now finally in the political cycle here, in the midterm cycle, finally. We've been talking about this for how long? I mean, think about it. Anthony Brindisi announced in June. Was it June?
Yes, in the summer.
So that's pretty early, but here we are. So what's the climate right now?
I think something interesting as the new year starts here, looking at sort of where the campaigns focus their efforts, what counties they think are particularly worthwhile to pursue, then obviously getting into endorsements and debates and how that goes. So it's definitely the next phase of the campaign is upon us.
And how much attention are we going to get here? I mean, I'm anticipating this is going to be a pretty hot market when it comes to a lot of outside money coming in.
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, I think electoral analysts, I think both congressional campaign committees have identified Central New York generally and the NY22 in particular as a highly contested race. A lot of people have this as a toss-up at this point, which is pretty remarkable. You think about the power of the incumbency advantage and how House incumbents are reelected, on average, over 95% of the time.
Hey, Marques had mentioned polling. You're hearing polls out. What did you hear, by the way?
Well, I don't know. I've just talked to some people casually that said that they think Anthony Brindisi polled well. I don't even know what the source of that is.
What are you getting out of that?
Well, so his campaign did some internal polling and found that his favorability was higher than Claudia Tenney's in terms of the ratio to unfavorability. He had declared early, according to him, to get his name out there and meet people. So the polling also showed that a lot of people weren't familiar with who he was. So I think the Brindisi campaign's modestly encouraged by the positive numbers and showed him within the margin of error of Claudia Tenney. The response from the Tenney camp was, we're fine with that. Once people learn who Brindisi is, they're not going to think highly of him.
So there's going to be the classic tie him to Nancy Pelosi. That's going to be a given, right?
Yes, and Governor Cuomo, too. I mean,
and
we've seen that in sort of coming out of Tenney's campaign and spokespeople. That's the main part of their strategy.
How dirty will it get, though? Are we going to go back to the Italian, the family, the insinuation on ties to the mob, for God's sakes? Are we going down that road?
That was an interesting
and that,
way
by the way, that was early from Claudia Tenney.
Yeah, just days before Brindisi declared with the knowledge that he was going to. I was surprised that was sort of how Representative Tenney began her conversation about Anthony Brindisi. I really can't say if it's going to come up again.
Do you think that hurt her? I talked to certain people that are obviously Italians who are extremely furious over that.
Well, here's the thing. In nationwide elections, like the presidential election, you can cast your opponents in certain ways. Yeah. We saw President Trump effectively brand Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, so on and so forth. It's a lot harder to do that in a localized election where people know Anthony Brindisi and they may not care for his policies, but they have their own conclusions about the type of person he is. And those types of approaches are much more difficult to be effective.
And I wanted to say, I think with these two, there's a different dynamic than there usually is in a race because they used to work together.
Right.
In Albany, they represent similar districts. And typically, when you get two representatives that are neighboring districts, they try to work together and stuff. I mean, it was apparent to me, just as an onlooker, that there wasn't a lot of good feelings. I don't think they were eating holiday cookies together then. And I think that when they get into this race and they start talking about each other and they bring up the other one's name, you can see their faces change a little bit. You know, like it's a little bit personal.
Yeah,
like I have a feeling that these two particular people don't like each other, independent of running against each other.
And I got to tell you, we've had them in studio where, but you know, everybody puts on the face. But Claudia didn't get along with any of the. It's the one thing that's happening now with the assembly. You have the what do they call them, the
Mohawk Valley Nine.
The Mohawk Valley Nine. I mean, and they keep talking about how we're all getting along now, and part of that is because it's not Claudia Tenney there in the assembly.
Well, one
it's
of those
Brian Miller, and they now all get along. But I think that they found ways to kind of be professional. They're both attorneys, so attorneys tend to.
They'll be professional, but
get
one of the
along,
things is
right?
Politically, nationally, and you know, he's the expert. We'll let him talk, but. Is that like that's almost like a badge of honor now, right? Like Trump is fighting with Steve Bannon, he's fighting with Jeff Sessions. I mean, his Rex Tillerson, who's the Secretary of State, called him a moron. You read the infighting in the book, and I think his voters a lot of time look at that as he's taking on the establishment, even though they're his own people.
Right.
You know,
right.
fired Attorney General, fired FBI Director. I think that her fighting with him is good for her voters. They like when you do that.
I think there's a definite. Absolutely.
Claudia is very tied with the president. It seems to be where she's going to go. Anthony, on the other hand, does he need to be the moderate candidate that he is right now? What if the Democrats? I might have asked you this previously. If they kind of pull him to the left, is that going to be a mistake?
Well, I don't see that necessarily happening. I think the Democrats understand, as you point out, that the potential path to victory is by establishing independence and getting support from.
Here's
from
a Democrat who's pro Second Amendment, for instance, and you kind of have to be if you live here.
Right, and I've written about that in my 22-minute that Brindisi is really out of step with Democrats when it comes to gun policy, and it's interesting how Democrats clearly are not looking for ideological purity; they're looking for someone who they think is competitive in this race.
Okay, going to be what other races around the state congressional? Are there any others that are key races you feel?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the race up in Syracuse with John Katko is going to be quite close. That's also one that's looked at nationally. John Thasso will have a difficult re-election race as well. I think Representative Stefanik is a little safer when we think about the districts.
She's a very interesting. I think she's an interesting candidate. She has she's very young too, right?
She is, yes, one of the youngest in Congress.
Yeah. Manesky.
I just wanted to ask, well, one comment. I remember when Brindisi and Tenney first got together, at least there was some playing nice initially. And I think I remember her saying she was kind of, I don't want to say using Anthony, but because he was a Democrat, it was a way for her to kind of float some bills out there, some ideas out there. And Anthony, I believe at the time, this is going back several years, was at least willing to do that. But anyway, I just wanted to.
I think the Italian comments have.
Oh, that's gone now. Oh,
there's no love.
Well,
lost.
also, just quick. I mean, with like what Bill said, I think there's a tradition of them working together. So if you talk to the state senator and the assembly person, they've always been from different parties. They've always worked together, and I think that's how it started out.
Yeah.
But if you talk to people that worked in the assembly or in Albany with Representative Tenney, a lot of them say bad things when they come back. I mean, at least privately. And
a lot of off the record, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, no, you're absolutely right about that.
And now the other thing that you've talked about, the changes in campaign mode. So they're in competition with one another. I think, as Bill mentioned, Representative Tenney adopts Trump's political style, which is deeply personal. It's on the offensive all the time. And I think whatever relationship they had, we're gonna see that continue.
And the taxes, I know it's passed now. It's still 10 months away, and you don't actually file your taxes till after the election. But I think
we
if
might see some in payroll
that,
taxes.
Yeah, I think if Republicans can frame that and say, listen, the average homeowner in the 22nd is going to get, or taxpayer is going to get $1,500, $2,000, I think that'd be a big sway. Because Anthony came out, at least initially, and was against this.
So right now, public opinion on the tax deal, the tax break, is not necessarily positive. But there's a long way between now and November.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I'm in the minority in thinking that vote's not going to hurt Representative Tenney as other analysts do. Obviously, it's problematic from a New York perspective, but given the dynamic of the district, tax cuts, deregulation, these types of things are fairly well received, and the details tend to be ignored to that extent. So,
all right. Okay, we have a lot of time to talk further because there's a lot to talk about, and this is just beginning. Well, we're in the middle of it, but it should be just beginning now. So, all right, Luke Perry, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And you can go to what's the easiest way to get to your NY22, your 22 minute?
UCpublicaffairs.com.
UCpublicaffairs.com, and Marques Phillips, you'll be back. Thanks, man.
Tomorrow?
Okay. You'll be back.
I'll be back one day.
Quick break. News, free money question, Tim Reed, and Mark Butler, Assemblyman Butler, doing a benefit for United Way. He'll release his commercial for that event, which every year is a God-blessed production. This year is no exception. It's almost way out there this year. That's the only thing I can tell you. Coming right back at WIBX.